Now let's consider what are related conditionals. And when we're saying related conditionals, we say we got a conditional statement, which is written in the form of if then. And then there's three types of related conditionals. One is the converse, and the converse is formed by simply swapping, exchanging the hypothesis for the conclusion. Then there's an inverse, and it's formed by negating both the conditionals hypothesis and conclusion. And then there is the contrapositive, and it is negating both the hypothesis and conclusion of the converse. In other words, it's flipping the hypothesis and the conclusion as well as negating. Now, another thing is with related conditionals, if the conditional statement is true, then the contrapositive is also going to be true. And in addition, if the conditional is false, the contrapositive is going to be false. And the same kind of relationship exists with the converse and the inverse. They're either both true or they're both false. So let's look here at a couple of examples to see what we have. So it says, write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of each conditional statement. Determine whether each related conditional is true or false. If a statement is false, find a counterexample. So we're first confronted with two angles have the same measure. Well, this is actually not in a conditional form, because a conditional form is going to be if then. So let's first put this in a conditional format. So we could then say if two angles have the same measure, then they are congruent. Well, I don't have any reason to dispute whether the two angles have the same measure, but certainly if they have the same measure, then they're going to be congruent. So I'm going to say that a conditional is true. Now let's talk about a converse. Now, converse is going to exchange the hypothesis and the conclusion. So in a converse, we would say if two angles are congruent, well, then they have the same measure. Well, that also is true. If two angles are congruent, then they're going to have the same measure. We know that to be true. So let's think about then. So with the inverse, we're negating both the original hypothesis and the original conclusion. So we could say if two angles do not have the same measure, then they are not congruent. Well, if they don't have the same measure, they're not going to be congruent. So that also is a true statement. And then lastly is the contrapositive. Now, the contrapositive is negating the converse. And the converse, again, we have exchanged the conclusion and the hypothesis. So let's see, a contrapositive in this situation then would read, if two angles are not congruent, then they do not have the same measure. Well, that also would be true. So in this case, all four of the related conditionals are true. Let's look at one where we may have it mixed up just a little bit. So here we're given a statement that a hamster is a rodent. Now, again, this is not in conditional form, so we're going to put it in conditional form, and let's say maybe this. If an animal is a hamster, then it is a rodent. Well, hamsters are rodents, so that's true. Now, what about the converse? The converse, again, we're going to swap the conclusion and the hypothesis. And so we'd say here that if an animal is a rodent, then it is a hamster. So if an animal is are there any rodents that are not hamsters? That's a question we might ask ourselves. And we know there are, so it's false. And as an example, as a counterexample, then, oh, a mouse is a rodent, a rat's a rodent. So that would mean that this statement is false. Well, what about the inverse? So the inverse is negating the conditional. So then that would read then, if an animal is not a hamster, then it is not a rodent. Well, it's not a hamster, but does that mean that it's not a rodent? No, it doesn't necessarily mean that, because, again, a mouse is not a hamster. And then lastly, let's take a look at the contrapositive. So the contrapositive, once again, is the negation of the converse, which is flip the conclusion in the hypothesis. And so we would say then that if an animal is not a rodent, then it is not a hamster. Well, that would be true. So what we see here is, in this example, that both the conditional and the contrapositive are true. Excuse me. And the converse and the inverse are both false. So again, once again, in these related conditionals, the conditional and the contrapositive either have to both be true or both be false. And the converse and the inverse also have to either be true or false. In other words, they're paired up together. So the truth value of the conditional and the contrapositive is going to be the same, and the truth value of the converse and the inverse are also going to be the same. And you might be saying, please get me out of here.